Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Philippa Duthie, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the director of the RSA's Oceania Network and also the co-host of the Regeneration Rising podcast. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the unceded lands from which I'm joining, the Gubbi Gubbi and Turrbal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Collectively, we stand in footsteps millennia old. Wherever you're joining from today, please join me in reflecting on those who've come before us, whose cultures and customs have nurtured the patterns of creation that give life to the places that we inhabit today. So, as I said, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the second event in our series of discussions around ethics and responsibility in a climate crisis, or a metacrisis, as we're going to be talking about today. In a moment, I'm going to be handing over to Nate Kinch, who will be hosting today's discussion. Nate is a socio-technology ethicist, an organizational designer, and trust researcher. And he's also one of our really committed fellows in our Melbourne network. But with that, I'm going to hand over now to Nate. Thank you, Nate.
Thanks, Philippa. Hi, everyone. I'm an hour ahead of Philippa down in Melbourne. I think now for the sixth time, I'm living in sort of like the inner north, and I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, not far from the banks of the Birrarung, the Yarra River, which is a really incredible part of the country, and I feel very grateful to be continuing to deepen my relationship to country. So following Philippa, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today is a big topic, a really big topic. I think the first one was a big topic, but we may even be expanding the scope with this one today. So I'm very excited because we're going to be joined, and I'm going to be attempting to seed, to the best of my ability, favorable conditions for a short, but I'm hoping very exploratory and illuminating dialogue between Jess and John. We're going to be talking about moral imagination and the metacrisis. By moral imagination, we probably mean something like, and noting that whenever we try to define something like this, that is a sort of living process, we are necessarily simplifying it. So we don't want to grasp onto the definition too tightly. It's just a sort of working scaffold, if you will. But something like our ability to, ideally together, think very deeply about not just possible futures, but truly preferable futures, and how we might be able to work together to bring those about or increase the likelihood that they become our lived reality at some point in time. By metacrisis, again, this is one of these things that different scholars, authors, commentators, etc., that are talking about the metacrisis talk about it in very many different ways. The folks from Civilizational Research Institute refer to the metacrisis as something like the total global ecosystem of interconnected crises, along with the underlying drivers or dynamics that give rise to catastrophic and/or existential risks, which is a pretty heavy sort of thing for us to be experiencing and relating to. But that does seem to somewhat usefully describe where we've come from, where we are, and thus the possibility landscape that's in front of us. So anyways, hopefully that's enough from me. Jess, I might, if you don't mind, can you give us the sort of TLDR summary? I know you've got extensive, very diverse background, but the TLDR summary of you as living process.
Yes, happy to. Thank you for the introduction, and happy to be here and see so many people joining. So I'm in Berlin, Germany, just to give you a back of my situatedness at the moment. Spring is coming, which is really nice. And my background, I mean, maybe I start briefly of just how I came to this work. And because it's driven by such a simple question that I think many of us are sitting with who are in the face of the meta crisis or who are acknowledging the meta crisis. And that's a simple question of how do I live my life? And as when I started out, and back then I just started out in engaging in these topics under the term of sustainability. And when I saw all these problems, I was just like, how then do I live my everyday life? And soon noticed how I'm just constantly hitting barriers and actually living according to my values. And this question is basically what's been the most dominant question, I would say in everything I do. It's led me down a long path of doing research, doing my PhD on the topic of the meta crisis, which I also often frame as relationship crises. And I can say maybe more about that later on. And it's, yeah, gotten me into just digging deeper and deeper. At the moment, I do that on the one hand within an institute that I founded called the Institute of Practical Eco-Philosophy. And then the other half of my time, I get to explore these questions at the university where I'm a professor and have a research project on the role of philosophy for the meta crisis, which just started out and is really exciting. And my background is actually in mechanical engineering, and I'm also teaching and situated at the university in the engineering programs. And so what I try to do is to bring these philosophical perspectives that I'm mostly digging into and perspectives from the humanities into this field of technology. And, you know, it's mostly students who are, a lot of them come from India. They come to Germany, want to work for Tesla or one of the big corporations and have nothing to do with the topics that I engage with in my everyday life. And it's almost like a burden for them, I would say. And I try to help them switch that frame maybe a little bit and just help them see that relevance for our everyday lives.
Okay, so thanks first of all for having me here, and a very important conversation to be had as well. So I'm a doctor of psychology. I'm a chartered psychologist. I'm based out of the University of Plymouth, where my research happens, and I also co-founded what's called imagery coaching as well, which is focused on looking at individual and team-based kind of motivation and imagery measurement through to coaching, corporate coaching ultimately. My background, as kind of Nate's alluding to, is sports primarily. So I am actually in Switzerland at the moment. I'm here at the World Archery Centre, working with projects around imagery and eye tracking and lots of cool things that we're doing. So my background might be sport, but I kind of shifted a few years ago, and I've been working more so on huge challenges. So people have generally a massive challenge. They'll often headhunt me and I'll go and work with them. So it could be a polar explorer looking to get a world record. So explorers, it could be astronauts looking at the self-sabotaging thoughts with world-class astronauts, through to working with net zero. So a lot of my work at the minute in research is focused on what I would call moral injury, and focusing on from values through to how people are imagining the future. And again, we're looking at recall through to fantasy, and our kind of forte is measuring imagination, which I'm guessing for a lot of you here, you haven't had your imaginations ever measured and assessed. So we assess imagination on different levels, and then we research, we look at intervention over time. So do we move the dial? That's the important thing for us as researchers is, what do we measure? Can we have an intervention that gets people to think a lot more, a lot clearly, shift mindset, shift attitudes, change cognitions, and ultimately changes behavior over time? And we do that through the eyes of imagination.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. And I think so. Look, there are so many directions that we could potentially go in, but Jess, I want to try and maybe bring together this idea of a relational crisis and your latest article on sort of like distrusting reality. I think that the frames of sort of like ontology, epistemology, ethics, etc., is interesting here, because we have a crisis of relation at kind of like every level of relationality, and that in a sort of in a slightly broader than a Wittgensteinian limits of my language mean the limits of my world kind of way. It's like, well, the limits of our stories, the limits of our cultural historicity, etc., limit what we imagine is actually possible. And so what I'm really interested in here is, all right, well, if we have this crisis of relation, what would it mean perhaps to use the types of techniques that Jonathan has been researching and co-creating and improving in the lab and in the field, to evolve our capacity to imagine these like relationally enriched realities of interbeing and interflourishing. I realize that there's nothing like that we can grasp onto quite there, but maybe that's something that the two of you can continue with, and we see where we get to.
Yeah, thank you for that start. And maybe if I share a few thoughts that come to mind immediately is that for me, it is very closely related, actually, this reframing as a relationship crisis instead of the meta crisis. And one of the things I have been constantly thinking about it since engaging in this sort of work is the ideas about communication and how do we frame things in order to make it accessible for people. You know, it quickly becomes super abstract. And also to frame it in a way that doesn't come across as, you know, like you need to do this and you should do this. So that's something that I saw quite a lot of, like people just pointing fingers at each other and not really seeing themselves as part of the whole thing. So one of the first points was seeing how I myself am deeply entangled with all of these crises. Like if it's just, you know, my phone, my computer, we all know this, like we're so deeply entangled with that. And we can't step out of that. So in framing it as a relationship crisis, I think what we do is that we actually give us a better possibility to think about it. Then the meta crisis could mean so many things. And if we think about it as a relationship crisis, it becomes more tangible, for me at least, to imagine of like what makes a good relationship. And then what I find interesting is that these relationships, you know, if it's a relationship pattern that I have with my mom, for example, you know, if I can't get in the right relationship with her, how can I expect the president of the US and the president of Russia or what have you to get in right relationships? So these patterns that are coming up in relationships between people and more than humans, between us and technology, like all these patterns, they are really fractal representatives of the patterns that we see in the larger system. And suddenly it becomes more tangible and it, at least for me, becomes more imaginable to see how can we actually change that.
When Jess is talking about this crisis of relation and kind of grounding our sense of how to be and how to act in the world and how to think in the world, etc., how to reflect in the world, how does that kind of land with you? And I'm sort of thinking, even in a very practical sense, how does that way of seeing these big picture relational challenges actually inform the work that you're doing with teams around the world or communities around the world?
I mean, it's interesting, you know, Jess has hit the nail on the head there, that the relationship crisis is a connection problem. We've never been more connected, but we are disconnected as well. And the issue we have also is this: we need human connection. We need human connection. We need to share on different levels, and that's really important. So often with our work, we'll kind of put the science to one side and we'll just connect with groups. Not surface level connection, not like, you know, do you like going for a walk in nature? Yes, I do. Cool, so do I. Great. It's more deeper level connection that draws people together. And as Jess was again saying earlier, you know, it starts with values. Understanding your values. Your values are your moral compass that drive you towards the direction you want to go in. But in terms of the way that we work, often the bigger the challenge, the bigger the goal. And often the bigger the challenge, the longer it takes to move the ship. So, you know, we often find that huge challenges are great to start with, but then people they plateau early and they become stuck. So a lot of the work that we do is unsticking people and teams to then focus back onto bigger goals, and that kind of resonates with a lot of our research. Whether it's looking at eating and looking at like healthy eating, or eating disorders, diabetes. We work in the health industry. These are all choices that you make, and I like the plug for the book, of course, with the choice point, and these choices that you make are very important. And we estimate that you have roughly 60 very important choices that you make in a day that define who you are. So the first thing that we often do is we allocate. We say, well, talk me through your most tricky, your most challenging choice point. What's the first one you make? And it could be getting out of bed when the alarm goes off. So we work with individuals on that level. It could be recycling or not recycling. It could be going for a run and being healthy, or perhaps not. So there's loads of things that we look at based on those choice points. And I think for when we talk about, I spoke very briefly about moral injury. Moral injury, we often see where your values are not aligned with your behaviors, and you have this, I need to be doing this, but actually it's in line with my value, but I can't do it for some reason, and you struggle, and you become anxious, and you become, it could be stress, it could be lots of different things, emotions that you'll feel, which then regulates emotion and regulates behaviors that you do. So again, we're working on different levels that we first locate, regardless of who we're working, whether it's politicians or military. What's your first choice point you're doing? We look at bookending your day well. The first thing that you do, but also the last decision you make before you go to bed, because it sets up the following day as well. So we do a lot of interventions, a lot of work around understanding people, but we always connect. Connection is the key here, because on your own, it can feel very, very lonely sometimes with big goals. So grabbing a buddy and grabbing a team then and motivating individuals is a very tricky thing to do, especially in big businesses where perhaps they've got different goals. But again, these are very important conversations to be had. So yes, that's generally where we start. We start with that human connection.
Jess, when you think about, so John is talking about these, and again, having now being quite familiar with your work now, John, I recognize how practical and tangible this is, and the scaffold that you create to decrease that sort of values action gap effectively. But Jess, when you're thinking about how to enact your values amidst this crisis of relation, where many things you probably just won't have visibility of tangible progress over, how do you act? What is your compass in such a context?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think something that I still, and I think many people struggle with, of not seeing the immediate feedback and the immediate relation that our actions have on the system, on the grander scale. And maybe just I want to relate to something that Jonathan said, because he said how they are, approaching people also in regards to their health issues, or working with health providers, for example. And for me, this was one of the greatest entry points into doing systems works, actually, coming from myself with an autoimmune disease, where I had to, shift a lot in my lifestyle, and seeing how I'm constantly being challenged by that. And I saw how that same pattern is playing out in my actions to sustainability, and to other people, how they are approaching sustainability issues. And the way I try to make sense of it, so there's a few frameworks or ideas that help me to think about my individual action and the systems on a grander scale. And one of them is that idea of, I think Joanna Macy is actually the first one who talks about this actively in terms of imagination, to imagine ourselves 7 steps into the future, or 7 generations into the future. And to see us from that perspective, how would we want us to act and be in the world? And this idea of, taking action, not having immediate feedback. Sometimes people say yeah, that's a melody of our online world and of our current system. But if we think about it, we humans are actually, and that's, I think, our greatest advantage, that we do, or that we are able to imagine, and where we need to practice that again. Because, people who are, building forests or planting trees where they can sometimes ripe or harvest the fruits only, 20 years later or so, always required us to think very fast or very far into the future and above our capacities of what we are experiencing in the immediate moment, or the feedback that we get in the immediate moment. So I think this is actually where imagination is increasingly or so important, that we practice this constantly, being aware that we are part of the system. So when I see my computer, that I call back into mind, like, what's all in this computer, like what are the people that had to work for it, what's going to happen with it when I'm done with it and dispose it, and that's one framework or one practice, I would almost say. It feels more to me to remind myself constantly, like, okay, I'm part of this larger system and things are related with each other. And another one is to think about, if you there is something in physics about crystals. So if you think about how crystals are forming, the way they are actually forming and bonding is that they are that the molecules make connections to other molecules that feel the most comfortable, you could almost say. So they bond in a way that's most comfortable for that crystal, and that might be very different in a different crystal. So once crystals start bonding in a certain way, they do form patterns of bonding, which then make this one unique crystal. And it's the relationship, though, between those different molecules that defines how the system overall, how the crystal overall looks. So if I think about that in terms of our system, it's the relationships in each and every relationship that I have that forms what the crystal/system is going to look like overall. Again, that's this thing of imagination, though. So I think it's very difficult to get to that without the imagination.
The way that we go about imagining the good, and thus how we might like to act, would probably radically differ. And so, Jonathan, I'm wondering, when you talk about working with values and helping folks understand what is it that truly matters to them, what are the things that you're actually like what are you working through, and how do you help folks expose what their values really are, and what the kind of like nested relationship of their value, like, is there some, I'm just thinking there's maybe an interesting bridge there to explore.
Yeah. Okay. So values first. There's a couple of things there. Firstly, we do lots of different values tasks and exercises with people, but generally, your values should be on your calendar, things that you do. So it could be, you discuss with people, what do you do in your spare time? What makes you you? And they may say, I go out with my family a lot and we go on long walks. So your family is very important. Okay, so clearly you're out and you're doing things. Oh, well, I don't really go out very much. So there's some kind of conflict, and we generally find this conflict or harmony, and then we work in that area to then explore the connect or the disconnect, perhaps. Going a bit further than that, there's always, it's great if you're in line with your values. Fantastic. We're generally working with people who are not, and they're not aware of their values, and they're struggling, and they haven't had a moment yet where their mindset has shifted. And so we're working with challenging people, generally in groups, who do not want to change. So sometimes we have imagination limiters where I don't think there's a future that I can buy into. So I'm going to stop thinking ahead. So that becomes a more depth of conversation to unpick. And then we have those who are in the future in great depth and detail, So I'm going to give you a quick story, right? Super quick. So working with an astronaut a few years ago, and she, and of course, all the talk nowadays is about going to Mars and resettling on Mars, and the imagination of that, of resettling in a different planet, it seems phenomenal to me. Okay, phenomenal. And she says, I was in the space station and looking down at the Earth, and you're a speck. Like you in the space station, you go over, you circle it, and you look down every so often, and you think, wow. But our issues, we magnify our issues. Like, we need to connect more. We need to connect more. And so I said to her, what was your moment where you kind of connected with yourself, with what you do? And she said, the strange thing is that when I got back to Earth after breathing this stale artificial air for weeks and weeks, I got back to earth, and I took off my my suit, and that first deep breath of fresh air in, we realized that we got it all here, right? We don't need to go anywhere else. We got it all here, and it was grounding. So I've never felt so grounded in my life, and it was a moment of clarity, where she felt connected for the first real time to our planet. And I think I'm not saying we should all go to space and have this moment come back, and be lovely, wouldn't it? But what I'm saying is that there's a moment often where your mindset shifts and you become connected. And it could be that you walk in a rainforest and things change. It could be that you're out with your family and things change. And I think that there's a moment for us all, and often for people, it happens in their 20s or maybe 30s, where there's a shift. And we're seeing it a lot more for youngsters now, actually. So I do a lot of work in schools, and there's a lot more talk around sustainability in schools, and being mindful of like carbon footprints and things, because it's a lot more in the curriculum. So again, there's a lot more awareness, but there needs to be this kind of moment. And there's often a moment in conversation where something connects, something resonates, and then behavior changes.
That's it's such a beautiful example, but one that pretty much no one will have the opportunity to experience. So I'm wondering, Jess, bringing it back. So you've got these presumably very smart folks coming over from different parts of the world. You said India particularly, and they're really interested in working in these very computationally or mechanically technical disciplines. Are you seeing these shifts occurring? If so, are there I'm going to use the word predictable very loosely, but are there kind of like predictable steps? Like, are you seeing, is there some sort of unfolding that's occurring that people are somewhat consistently going to when they get to the point where they have this type of, oh my gosh, I'm this relational being in this kind of like super organism of Gaia? Like, what? Yeah, is there something there that you're noticing as a pattern? As John said, we're not going to have the opportunity to go out of space and come back. So what are other ways that we might be able to encourage these types of truly deep realizations and reorientations?
Yeah, something that I noticed, and this is confirmed by theory on transformative learning, actually, of how do these deeper shifts in, not just in our ways of thinking, but really in our ways of being and acting happen. Like, what's needed to make this deeper paradigm, worldview, philosophy shift? And for me, this shift, it is always something that's not just about thinking or mental, but it's also tightly or it has to be tightly connected to our ways of being and acting. Otherwise, it's not really a shift. It's just like one dimension that's changing a little bit, or some thought patterns that might be changing. And what I'm seeing is that it usually starts with a disturbing moment for a person. And this can happen, though, on so many levels. I mean, it could be a documentary someone watches around like animal welfare or so. It could be a personal health crisis, but it is, or at least so far from what I see, and also from the students where I try to take them on such a transformative learning journey, what I see for the ones where I do see shifts happening, it's when they suddenly of something that they are noticing taps deeply into their values and really disturbs, like, oh my gosh, what have I been doing? So it starts sort of with a crisis moment, from what I am seeing. And in transformative learning, they are also in the theory, they are also starting with saying we need this moment of disturbance first, and then in order to sort of start developing our own ways of thinking about that differently. And maybe if I can add to that at the beginning, so at one point I had this, this was part of my PhD research, where I actually tried to create this, very formal transformative learning journey to take people from a mechanistic worldview, how I refer to it, to a relational worldview. And I developed that curriculum with a few of my colleagues, and we had a clear outcome of what they should think in mind when we started. And at one point I noticed just this idea of trying to make people think and act and be a certain way from the very beginning. That's already part of the problem that I'm trying to address, actually. And in complex systems, in thinking of the Metacrisis in terms of relationships, these clear cause and effect ideas are just not working. So, you know, as soon as I try to put people into this process of this is what you have to get to, then I'm already thinking of them as a machine, sort of, like I can program from the outside. And even though, you know, there is possibilities for that, and I think there is a reason, or there is part of us that also needs to embrace these mechanistic, because we do have mechanistic parts in us, and it's good to embrace them. You know, Ian McGilchrist talks about our left and our right hemisphere, where our left one is very mechanistic, analytic, and the right one is, you know, connecting to this greater whole and embracing complexity and the gestalt of things. And so we have both capacities. So I think it makes sense to use both of them. But for me, I notice how I'm constantly learning, and this is really an ongoing process of when do I step into one mode and when do I step into the other. And from the teaching, at least how I do it at the moment, it's often a lot easier to, you know, treat students as machines, where I think like, okay, this is the outcome that I want to get out of you. So it's a reminder of myself as well that, yeah, let's also, let's see what comes out of it. I can plant some seeds, but I don't know what happens after.
I like that idea as well, because I'm mindful that with a lot of stuff that we're doing, and around the brain stuff as well, is that people switch between left and right, left and right, left and right all the time, because they're thinking about the minutiae, the process, the goal driven, like what can I do right now? What's the process look like, through to like what's the future look like? So you're always switching. Like it's not necessarily hemisphere switching, but it's the process of bigger goal. How does it fit within who I am and my identity? Switching back into what can I control this week? What can I control right now? What can I do right now? So there's this ongoing shift of attention, shift of focus, which is kind of how we're wired of you know, thinking about these bigger problems. I think that the bigger the goal, and I love doing imagination work with people where we start with a huge goal, but again, a huge goal is overwhelming, right? It's completely overwhelming. So, and there's lots of research and work on that kind of climate distance. How far in the future should we imagine? So if we go too far in the future, it becomes not really tangible. So that's why a lot of things are kind of, you know, plans are 2030 plans, you know, keep it in the 5-year remit. 5 years seems to be the sweet spot of how we should look at the future. And then back to what can we do in the 1 year? What can we do in the 1 week? What can we do today? What can we do in the next hour? What can we do immediately? So I think that framing over time is really critical to kind of ball those big ideas. And I'm mindful that we want to look really far into the future because it really matters. At the same time, when we go too far, it creates inaction.
Yeah, there's a bridge that I'm thinking of here before we kind of invite some questions, and I've seen that there's stuff coming through the chat, which is really great. So what I was thinking of there, John, was something like this holonic sort of type relationship between the big and the very small, or the very far and the very near. And I think there's something there, and how do we healthily hold those tensions and live dynamically those tensions? The other thing that, Jess, I was thinking of when you were talking, was more like our modes of being, doing, and becoming, and how do we healthily and dynamically balance those modes, recognizing that they're not entirely distinct, of course. Yeah, which is a challenging one, because, you know, coming back, you know, you're both working in environments where you're researching, you're publishing, you're practicing, you're educating. And if I sort of go back to, like, let's just say even the frame of being, doing, and becoming, like if someone said that to me at school, I'd be like, what are you talking about? Like it's like, it is so paradigmatically different. It's crazy. And I would have probably made fun of it, right? Because that's a fear response, it's a conditioning, it's all these things, right? But I want to be as honest with myself as I can. So I'm just sort of as we lead into questions, something that I'm curious about in terms of maybe seeking some responses from everyone else that's here with us. How do you think about the near and the far, the small and the big, and your relation to the near and the far, the small and the big, or your awareness or attunement or relation to your modes of being, doing, and becoming? And like, are there practices that you've engaged in this context that you found very helpful?
Two things on that. Readiness. Like youngsters, they're not ready yet. They're not ready, right? So readiness is really important. We can measure readiness. So we look at like readiness scales and confidence scales and things. So we look at a lot of that. And then self-awareness, right? Like knowing yourself. And again, the better leaders, the better people who are working in the forefront have got a very good understanding of themselves. They know who they are and they're self-aware. So I think that they're the two main focuses that I think to kind of connect with those questions: readiness and self-awareness. And the coaching field does a great job at improving those two factors. So I think it's not an easy answer is like, let's just do some scales and figure out what's going on. I think it's a conversation that you have with people. It's that, as Jess was saying at the start, that human connection, connecting and being related to others is really critical, and that will shape and help who you are and foster that kind of self-awareness and understanding. So I don't think it's an easy, like, there's a few things in the toolkit. I mean, there are, if you're a coach or a psychologist, etc., working in that area. But it's a challenging conversation. And my final thought is some people, they're fantasy thinkers. They're thinking into the future. They like that and they like the fascination with it. Some people do not like that. They are logical. What can I control right now? I don't want to go. I'm not going to think too far in the future. And some people actually have no visual imagination at all. They have aphantasia, and they will struggle to have a conversation with you about fantasy because they are rooted in what is now. So you need to understand the individual. They need to understand how they work, and that's part of this process and part of this conversation around that increasing awareness.
Jess, just thinking about the readiness and self-awareness piece. When you think of readiness and self-awareness and connection to this bigger picture, this different story of Gaia, like what is it that you're seeing in young people, and are they developing together, or are you seeing some, like, is there a specific role for like the proper teacherly authority? Like, there's a bunch of stuff there that I think I'm really interested in.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say to this, and I think it really depends on the groups. Or from my experience, I've worked in very different teaching settings and with very diverse groups, and it really depends on the groups and how far, there's more like this setting of the teacher and the students and how far they are learning together. And I've seen groups where, they were just so self-motivated by exploring together that the teacher, it's really, and I think for me, this is an ideal state where the teacher is rather the facilitator in a sense. And I do want to come back, though, it doesn't fully answer to your question, Nate, but if I might add to that, because John mentioned a few times how we need to reconnect with other humans, and it is about connection. And coming back to the overarching frame of moral imagination or moral imaginings, what I see is that one great part of what we need to reimagine in a way, because in a sense it's already there, is our connections, not just to humans, but that we are at the same time connected, to the non-humans surrounding us, to the technology. So asking ourselves, how can we imagine being again in different relationships to them? And from that comes also a moral responsibility, an innate moral responsibility towards those relationships. And I mean, in an ideal world, I'd be able to in my teachings, to help people see this innate connection that is there. And as soon as we start seeing that, it's very hard to escape that responsibility that we have towards that.
Yeah, and this is something that I think you've both either, explicitly or implicitly alluded to, is this kind of like, it can't be just propositional, like fact-based. You can't just go, hey, here's how biospheric systems and subsystems work, and here's the effect of, the totality of human activities over the course of, the last few hundred years particularly, and therefore this is the kind of trajectory that, like, it's like there has to be some sort of like lived experience. There has to be some emergence through emergency you know, in the sort of Bucky Fuller sense, there has to be some sort of crisis. But like, I'm wondering, and there's this part of me that that remains somewhat hopeful that we don't have to solely rely on these reaching the low of the low in order to evolve. And I'm particularly interested in the ways in which we can support one another in balancing that which might necessarily require us to fully immerse ourselves in some direct or more broadly relational challenge that, excuse my French, but like fucking hurts us, to encourage some type of action. Can that be balanced with these slightly more proactive orientations towards shifting worldview and kind of like relational action? Do either of you have any comment there?
Yeah. I love it. I love this. It's there's a great books by Rob Hopkins. I'm not sure if people know Rob Hopkins. Again, environmental. I work with Rob as well on various net zero projects. There's a task that has come from Rob, which is, you know, we have the discussion around what if, and this is one of his books, right? What if to what next? What if we did achieve it? What if we did make changes? What if we did? But let's keep in that positive mindset. So you do the task, and you go through these what ifs, right? You're using imagery to explore what if we did, what if the air was cleaner, what if the birds were louder, what if the, you know, so you go through all of these what ifs, and then the next part is, okay, so what do we do about it? What's next? What do we do? Let's go. What's our first step? So that's a really easy task to engage everyone. It creates a lot of discussion around this process, and it engages people in a very positive conversation, using imagery to explore all those permutations. And people will always say, yeah, but, you know, these things, that's okay, right? These things will happen. What if we overcame that obstacle? So again, keeping that positive spin throughout has been really, really eye-opening when working with Rob. And he's going globally and working with lots of different places, organizations, on this whole concept of using imagery through what ifs conversations.
Love that. It's really nice, you know, like, you know, the history of psychology, you know, the positive dimension is newer. There's a bunch of stuff in the comments, like, and there's been sort of a bit of almost like back and forth that I'm seeing, but one thing that has sort of just kind of like spotlighted a little is a comment from Danny in Winchester saying, is the key issue simply to understand what Gaia is and how important that like internalizing and living that view is? And then there's additional commentary, which then perhaps takes us into Maslow's hierarchy, which could be reframed for like our current predicament, opportunities, etc. Like in terms of like, so yeah, like how important do you both think that very different sense of what we are and what we are experiencing and what we are expressions of is? Like, is that sufficient as a starting point? Is that kind of like how we see this, or?
Is it okay if I go first, Jonathan? Yeah. Okay. So one thing that comes to my mind is, and it's I saw the iceberg model also being mentioned in the comments, and I want to relate these two a little bit. One of those things that I did at the beginning of my research was looking at the iceberg model and trying to find this deeper level of what is it that actually changes overarching system. And what Donella Meadows says, you know, she says it's being able to change our paradigms and mindset, and this is the greatest level. I talk in terms of changing our philosophy. It has the greatest level to change the overarching system. Well, when I started to adapt a more relational philosophy, I noticed like how if I really truly try to think relationally, there can be no one single level, but it's all like putting a hierarchy in it is already coming from this rather mechanistic understanding, which doesn't mean that it's not useful at all. I still think philosophies and changing mindset has one of the greatest levels. At the same time, for me, it's like acknowledging there is no one level. So even understanding Gaia and understanding as relational being, even though on some sense, it is the greatest level, but in a different sense. And it's a bit paradoxical. And I think being able to hold these paradoxes is also one of the keys that I try at least to teach students. Because I think it is at the same time that we don't have this big lever or this one thing. And I think the beauty in that is if we truly acknowledge that there is no lever, then again, it enables us to act, or it makes us gives us a lot more agency, because suddenly we see that each action, no matter, if I'm working in politics or if I work on the individual level, consumerism, like there's also often I see debates from people saying like, this is more important. No, this is the most important. If we acknowledge really this relational dimension, it's like, it's all important. and in a way it's unsatisfying. And I think there is still issues, that matter more than others, but at the same time there is not. And yeah, I like that, to sit in that tension and to try to act from that tension.
Polarity is reality.
I love that.
John, anything to add there?
Yeah, just slightly. So I personal preference, Maslow's a little bit overrated, right? For me, I feel like it's and that's because I work with people who achieve goals and who self-actualize for about 15 minutes before they reset another goal, right? So you self-actualize and you go, what's next? Let's go again. And I work with Olympic athletes. When you self-actualize your goal, you can become very depressed as well. On like, okay, let's go again. So maybe we all need to improve the hierarchy of needs. But yeah, it's a great fundamental model to get us to think about the steps. But it repeats and it repeats, and we evolve and we develop and we refine as we achieve goals. So I think again that the whole what if concept of what can we do beyond the goal? We achieve the goal. Okay, what's next? What can we do beyond that? Why is it important for us to go beyond that? And again, working with organizations, we could achieve some kind of carbon-based goal. And then how do we connect on going from a business to a community to your local kind of infrastructure, to national to international? And I think that is going beyond your goal is a really critical conversation to have.
John, Jess, thank you so much for joining us. Philippa, thank you as always for bringing this about. Thank you to the RSA for their ongoing support, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. As I said at the start, I felt very privileged to be here with these two very fine humans whose work I deeply respect and admire and learn a lot from. So thank you both for the opportunity, and I hope we continue in this process together.